Good morning, welcome. I'm Chris McLaughlin. I'm going to moderate our session this morning, and here's the plan. The three of us are going to introduce ourselves and launch into just a little bit of content, and then we're going to do more of a panel-style Q&A. We invite you all to share questions, comments, anything you want to know. This is absolutely a space where shared learning is the goal. And so please feel free to not think about too hard the words or the phrasing or those pieces. Just ask questions, and we're here to answer and share some insights on inclusion for LGBTQIA+ individuals within the workspace. Again, I'm Chris McLaughlin. I'm a clinical social worker. I'm the owner and lead consultant of Inspired Consulting Group. I've got a table downstairs. I've recognized some friends that I've met already this week. I'm going to let folks introduce themselves up here, and then I think we'll let Gia get started with your section.
Okay, is this on? Great, I'm gonna get up, and the clicker's right there if I need the clicker. Super duper. Can y'all hear me okay? You're like, y'all? Does that feel good? Anyone else from the South? No? Kind of. Okay, good. Yeah, kind of. Why not? Yeah, right. Global South. I like folks. I like y'all. Beautiful people. Good morning. I'm Gia Drew. She, her pronouns. I'm going to keep getting closer to you just because you're all the way back there. I'm the executive director at Equality Maine, and there's going to be some slides. So if you can't see the slides and you want to see them, you can move closer. If you don't want to see the slides and you can stay in the back, that's cool too. If you don't know what Equality Maine is Maine's oldest and largest LGBTQ advocacy organization. We're in our 40th year as an organization. We started in 1984. After a horrible tragedy where a young man was murdered in Bangor, and a group of community members formed a group to make sure that this never happens again in the state of Maine, and that anyone who's LGBTQ or anybody can walk down any street in any town at any time without fearing for their life. And that little community group over the years has morphed into what is now known as Equality Maine. I joined Equality Maine in 2012 as a volunteer on the marriage equality campaign. Before that, I was a high school teacher and coach for 20 years, much of that here in the state of Maine. During that time, I transitioned on the job in 2010-11. In over a matter of months, I went from Mr. Drew in the classroom to Miss Drew, and where I was track and field coach, I went from Coach Drew to Coach Drew. See how much easier it is when, like, who knew coach was like gender inclusive? In doing so, I became the first out transgender public school teacher here in the state of Maine and the first transgender high school coach in the entire country. And that sounds fantastic. I'm a competitive person. I grew up in a family with 9, and getting any mashed potatoes and gravy, you had to be a little competitive. But being first isn't always like the best thing in the world, because when I came out 15 years ago, there was no roadmap for my employer, which was a school system, for my colleagues at work, for the parents of all the other students and the athletes, and that road was very rocky. And unfortunately, a year into that, my position was eliminated, and I became unemployed, and virtually unemployable as an out transgender person here in the state of Maine. Regardless of all the wonderful laws and policies that we have here in the state of Maine, and this is a really important part of this story, is the work we do is about, yes, making sure there are laws and policies on the books that we can lean into or fall back on. But if you don't have people's hearts and minds with you, it's going to be a bumpy road. And so I joined Equality Maine as a volunteer, and now, nearly 13 years later, I'm the executive director of the organization and the leading voice in this state for LGBTQ rights and one of the leading voices on trans rights in this country. So I can actually look back and say, you know what? I am so thankful I lost my job. Has anyone ever said that? Yes. Oh my God, I love this. You know, sometimes you think you have your dream job, and then you realize maybe this isn't the job for me, or maybe there's something else out there for me that's even bigger and better. And looking back now, I'm like, you know what? I am actually so grateful that that happened to me. It opened my eyes and my heart to what still needs to be done here in the state of Maine to make sure that everybody gets to participate fully in their lives from birth until death. And so it's an honor now to lead Equality Maine. And in this sort of climate right now, I want to highlight a couple things about where we are in terms of LGBTQ rights nationally and then locally here in the state of Maine, specifically related to employment, because that's kind of why we're here. And then later on, we'll have some panel discussion. Hopefully you have some questions for all of us as we get there. Woo. So, United States is not a monolith as a country in terms of LGBTQ rights. And sadly, over the last 5 years, our country is becoming more hostile to LGBTQ plus people. Just in 2015, United States and the Supreme Court ruled that marriage equality was the law of the land, and we were going in a very different direction in 2015 as a country, here in Maine as well. More and more states were passing more ordinances and laws that protect LGBTQ people from discrimination in all aspects of lives. Whiplash occurred, and we've gone in the other direction. And so as you can see here, the dark green states are the states that have really strong protections for LGBTQ people in all aspects of their lives, from education to employment to public accommodations to housing to credit, those areas. So where you see the dark green, that's where the policies and laws are really strong. And if you represent or part of an organization that has multiple places and spots, it's really important to know what's going on in those other places. Or if people are moving to here from other places, or if people are thinking of relocating, you have a better sense of what the climate and landscape is across the country. And I think that's really important. This is a very misleading slide. So this is employment non-discrimination. And the only reason the whole country is green is that in 2022, the Supreme Court ruled in 2 cases that gender identity and sexual orientation are protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in the mid-60s. It was pretty historic. And that gave protections for employers who have, I think, a certain number, 15 or more employees are protected nationwide against discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity. Right now, the federal government doesn't want to recognize this, as you may imagine, unfortunately. So it's probably going to be tested again soon. But right now, there are federal protections for employment. There are very few other protections for LGBTQ people other than marriage out across the country in terms of federal law. There's only a few federal laws that protect LGBTQ people. There's marriage, there's employment. That's about it. If we actually look at where employment non-discrimination actually exists, if we actually look at state laws, it's more of that patchwork again in terms of where you are in the world. And sometimes some states have municipalities that have been allowed to pass ordinances. So you may have a more, lack of a better word, red state, but you may have a purple dot in that state that has already passed some municipality ordinances. Some states actually do something called preemptive, and they kind of block their local municipalities from doing that, unfortunately. But that's you can see the patchwork there in terms of protection state by state. And this should be another slide. Which way do I point this thing? There? Oh, see? There you go. Now, if we take a little closer look at Maine, and I don't know why you're in Maine. I don't know if this is your place, if this is your home, this is where you were born and raised. Not me. I was born in Boston, but I've been in Maine now for 26 years. And one of the reasons I'm here and remain here, and have actually moved away and came back, was we are one of the best states in the country on LGBTQ rights. I don't know if you knew that. And we have really clear indicators of where our laws are in terms of non-discrimination. Employment, housing, public accommodations, credit and lending, non-discrimination for state employees, and it goes on, which is really, really impressive and really important. And so folks are actually wanting. I was just talking to a real estate agent a minute ago and talking about people wanting to move here and relocate, resettle, for all sorts of reasons. And some of those reasons are for their safety for themselves as being part of the LGBTQ community, or their children who are LGBTQ. And they want to make sure they're living and working in a state that will give them some protections. And Maine is one of those places. Some interesting statistics, see, I can't speak, are how many LGBTQ people there are. You know, you can't always tell someone's LGBTQ by looking at them. You know, if you saw me walking down the street, you'd be like, oh, who's that really cool goth future person with that crazy hair and those boots? You may not know that I'm queer or trans just by walking down the street. I don't have a big sign. I don't always carry a pride flag. So a lot of people that you work alongside, you may not know they're LGBTQ unless they tell you. And that's really the only way you know, unless someone says, hey, by the way, if you didn't know, you know, there's that. Here in the state of Maine, about 7% of the adult population says they're LGBTQ based on the latest sort of polling. And that number has slowly gone up over time. We're not the highest number, and I'm trying to get better there. I got to get ahead of like Vermont and some other states. I really am competitive. What I think is really telling is the future workforce. We always talk about workforce development in this world. Anyone gone to a panel or a conference on workforce development? Of course, right? How do we attract and retain all sorts of people? And in today's workforce, making sure that Gen Z and the younger generation feels included and excited to come to work, making sure your workplace is inclusive of everybody, including LGBTQ people, is important. It's not only important, it's imperative. So you can succeed and continue doing the work you want to do. And nationally, and here in the state of Maine, 25% of all teenagers identify as LGBTQ. That's the future. That's the future workforce. 1 in 4 of your employees are LGBTQ. And so it's important to recognize this, that we can't ignore that. They are customers, they are employers, they are your contractors, whatever you want to look at it, right? And so it's important to recognize where we're going. And here in the state of Maine, we are one of those unique places where things for LGBTQ people are relatively good compared to some other places. And there's definitely dangerous things and hard things happening all over the state, but in relative terms, we're one of those islands, which is really wonderful. I think I have one more slide. Maybe I don't. Maybe I do. I do. So this past year, nationally, that wave of attacks on LGBTQ people have continued across the country, with nearly 600 anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced in state legislatures. Here in the state of Maine, there were significant attacks on our community. There were 8 very specific anti-trans bills that were introduced in the legislature, plus many other bills. And we were able to, Equality Maine and our coalition and partners, build a campaign to defeat all 8 bills. Thank you. That's really great. I will say it was daunting because the climate has shifted so much and there's so much hostility, specifically against transgender people like me and kids, that when we first started tracking these bills and did an initial, we call this a whip, which where you count where the votes may be, we noticed that we were short more than 25 votes to protect these laws. And we're like, oh shit. And this was back in February. And we thought that wave of momentum against trans people and kids was just going to continue. But because of the coalition's work in raising public sort of information around what it means to be trans and sort of pop those bubbles on the stereotypes and disinformation and misinformation and having a lot of hard one-on-one conversations with people, that number went from 25 down to 4 in the legislature. And because we, pro-equality folks, had a majority in the Senate, in the House, and we have a governor that supports LGBTQ people, we were able to defeat those 8 bills, which is one, thank you, Meredith, appreciate that. But, you know, our lives are not monoliths as LGBTQ people, and so we're connected to many other issues out there, not just these really specific ones. So you can see that we participated in probably nearly 80 different bills this legislative session that had to do a whole host of things related to the LGBTQ community, like aging, like substance use, like housing. So many different areas intersect with being LGBTQ. And so I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about LGBTQ rights, we're also talking about all the different aspects where our lives come in contact with all these different places in law specifically. So in the end, we were in a much better place. We know these attacks are not going to stop right now, and we're trying to do what we can to mitigate harm to our community, understand what's coming from Washington towards us, helping our elected officials and our leaders in the state capitol navigate all the pressure on them related to funding, healthcare, all those areas. So it's important that we work together. That includes with employers, non-traditional partners, to make sure that LGBTQ people, young and old, can thrive and live here in the state of Maine. And I think that's, I might have one more? Oh, yeah, I didn't want to talk about this because this is just so depressing. I want to go back one. Gia, go back one. There it is. Yeah, maybe I blocked this out because I just don't want to face all the onslaught of stuff that comes from the White House virtually every day. The attacks on our community are relentless. And it's one executive order after another. And many of them are really specific attacks on businesses, universities, state governments, foundations, funders, you name it. They're attacking us so you capitulate and give in. And, you know, some folks have. Just the other day, Brown University, you know, said we're going to capitulate and we're going to compromise with the president to do this and that. Some folks have stood up and said, no, we're not going to do that. Our state is kind of in the middle of that. The governor is working really hard to fight back, but at the same time, the university system capitulated on some areas related to trans rights, which is unfortunate. And then Supreme Court ruled in a couple cases this past year around healthcare and school curriculum that we thought was really harmful. So this is ongoing, and so our job at Equality Maine is to make sure that we understand what's happening in relationship to our national partners so we can translate that to all of you and all our Maine community so people understand the reality of the situation, giving them the tools that they need to take those next steps, whether that's talking to a lawyer, whether that's doing something else in their lives, or just staying put or getting more active so they feel like they're part of the resistance maybe. So I hate looking up at that. Anyways, but we are resisting. And that's a good thing. We're not taking this lying down. Many of us are part of this fight. And the people you work with depend on a place to go to work. And they don't, you know, the people I talk to just want to go to work, have a great life. They don't feel like they have to defend their lives when they go to work. And that's really important too. And we're going to talk a little bit more today about what you all can do to make sure that your workplace is inclusive and welcoming of everybody, especially LGBTQ plus people. So Gia's going to stop talking now and give it back to Chris. Okay.
Thanks, Gia. Before I move into the next section, I just want to pause. Thank you, Gia. And are there any immediate thoughts or questions for Gia while this information's fresh? And we'll certainly have time at the end to talk more. Okay, so, that's not what I expected to see. So again, I'm Chris McGlaughlin. I'm a clinical social worker by training. A good part of my last 25-year career has been working with queer youth and families A lot of that has also been around supporting organizations and individuals to create more inclusive, supportive environments, whether that is home environments, whether that's foster care environments, whether that's school-based environments, especially when it comes to the needs of queer youth. And my hope for the next couple minutes is to share with you all some leadership competencies that you may be able to take back to your organizations or to your practice around, again, this idea of inclusivity for LGBTQIA plus individuals. And it starts with this leadership graphic you're looking at now. Some folks in the room have heard me talk about this. This is really a framework of how I approach leadership in all areas of my life. And it starts with looking at these two axes around confidence and competence. And I can talk way more about this. Feel free to find me afterwards. But what I want to focus on is this fake it till you make it quadrant for individuals who may have a high degree of comfort, of confidence, but not necessarily a high degree of skill, of competence. And in this space, in this work, in this time period, having that comfort is huge. But faking it till you make it, that adage that many of us probably grew up with or maybe still tell ourselves now, only works for so long when the stakes are this high. And so I want to thank everyone for coming to this session and really, I think, matching comfort and skill so that this wink and a smile we got you doesn't feel as performative as maybe it might have in the past. So what are some of the skills that are needed for leaders? Friend in the back, if you can help me go forward, that's awesome. Thank you. So 7 core leadership skills that will help champion LGBTQIA plus inclusion in the workplace, and it starts with cultural humility, the ability to just recognize that we are part of something larger than ourselves and approaching our uniqueness and what makes us so special with curiosity and introspection and just a desire to learn and be empathic with others who have different lived experiences. I think this idea of empathy and cultural humility is where leadership efforts in this work start. Our next competency is around the ability to create psychologically safe and trauma-informed environments. Do folks know what I mean by those two concepts? Yeah, great, right? So making sure that everyone feels safe the moment they walk into their workplace to the moment they leave, and that we're approaching every discipline, every field that we practice in a way that's trauma-informed. And I think of trauma-informed practice in the same way I think of hand washing or bloodborne pathogens. It's that assumption that everyone I come into contact with has had something hard happen to them that they may be still processing, whether it was 20 years ago or this morning. And when I take that approach with interacting with other individuals to make sure that I'm not inadvertently re-traumatizing and things that I say or the way that I'm behaving, it makes for both a safer and kinder workspace. The third competency is around our communication skills, making sure that we're using language that is as inclusive as possible. I'm somebody that tries really hard to assume best intent. And so recognizing that when somebody may say something that doesn't quite land with me or with somebody else the way that was intended, or hopefully not the way it was intended, that's an opportunity to press pause and do some education, do some course correction. And hopefully that individual who inadvertently found a foot in their mouth has that ability to step back and reflect, learn, do things differently next time. And communication for me is as much about written language as it is spoken language. So I think about interoffice communications, newsletters, social media posts, our websites, just making sure that we're as inclusive as possible and welcoming as possible with our language. and not leaving folks behind, or worse, traumatizing or triggering folks. The fourth competency I want to share with you all, drum roll, is equity-driven decision making, making sure that we are being very intentional and deliberate when we have decisions to make as leaders, that we've got equity always on the radar screen. Are we making decisions that include all, that may level a playing field, that may ensure that folks get just what they need to be successful? And as you all know, equality and equity are two different concepts. And so really thinking about equity versus just giving everyone the same thing and hoping they make the best of it. The fifth skill I want to share with you is around, oh, now it works. The fifth skill is allyship and advocacy. Thanks back there. So two very, I think, very clear concepts, but really difficult to put into practice, especially in the times we're in today. Making sure that we are speaking up as leaders for our LGBTQ staff members or consumers, clients, customers, and making sure that we, again, are acting with intentionality and courage around this allyship principle. The sixth skill is our ability to listen and build relationships, tell stories. I think Gia brings a really great point about the ability of sharing stories and how that changes hearts and minds. And making sure that we've created space in the workplace for that storytelling to happen. Maybe it's the first couple minutes of a staff meeting. Maybe it's shared lunches, after work activities. But we've created space for storytelling to take place. And the final skill I want to share with you is around our ability to be have courage and be brave as leaders. This world is scary, even on its best days. And as Gia points out, right now it's really overwhelming in how scary it can feel. And trust me when I say that young people are feeling it as well. And so one of my larger takeaways for you all is this idea that if you are not checking in with your queer staff members, you are not acting in a way that is aligned with allyship, empathy, or advocacy. This community is having a hard time right now at all ages. And so making sure that as part of your check-ins or one-to-ones, or even just the casual conversations around the office, just offering that supportive ear. Hey, I know it's a lot right now. How you doing? Or I'm here if you need anything from me. Sometimes that's all it takes. So we'll have some time at the end of our session to talk more about these things, and I'll be here for the rest of the day if folks want to chat. But I'm going to let Michelle tell her story.
You want to advance it one, please? One more. So my name is Michelle Weinzettel, and you might recognize the person in the picture, maybe not. That's me. Anybody in here born after 1988? Kind of thought so. I started policing in 1988. I was 7, so we're clear. I had a very good career. I spent 27 years as a police officer, 17 of those years as a police chief in 3 different communities. I did all that in Minnesota. During my time as a police officer, police chief, I went back and got my bachelor's, my master's, and a doctorate in higher education, authored a book, spent a lot of time educating law enforcement executives around the country. Ultimately ran a public safety leadership program at a state college and got recognized by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is a fraternal organization for law enforcement, the largest one in the world. And they invited me to come work for them to do studies of police organizations, broad, every kind of soup to nuts kind of studies to help organizations, police organizations, improve. I had been active with them as a police chief, knew some people there, and they invited me to come and work for them, and so I did. And I did all of this as the other me, as I referred to in the before times. During that time, I did a number of studies across the country, and I won't go into the details, but ultimately became a little bit disenfranchised with the organization I was with. In the middle of that, by accident, I got an email from someone from a company called Barry Dunn. If any of you are from here, you may have heard of Barry Dunn. That's who I work for. I'm a senior manager currently with them. I decided to escape from IACP and go to Barry Dunn. I just had my 7th year anniversary with Barry Dunn. And again, I did that in the before times as well. Doing the same kind of work for Barry Dunn with multiple clients around the country. During that time, right in the middle of COVID in 2020, Barry Dunn brought in a speaker during Pride Month. They brought in a speaker, Gia Drew, via Zoom to talk about trans people and of course the rest of her organization as well. But certainly Gia spent some time talking about that, and she said something during that presentation that really struck a chord with me. And she said, trans people have to risk losing everything to gain anything. And it was like a lightning bolt that went through me. For me, I had lived, I won't say how many years, I'd lived a number of years not feeling right about I had a great life. I had a wonderful marriage, 3 terrific kids. I was arguably at the pinnacle of my profession in a male-dominated world, past president of the Minnesota Chiefs Association, and yet I didn't feel whole and authentic about myself. And, you know, we sometimes forget how we affect people with the little things we do that we think are seemingly innocuous. I can't imagine during Gia's presentation that she considered what that might turn out for someone like me. But it was very impactful. And I will tell you that what I want to talk a little bit about is what happened after that. Because this is really all about how do we think about inclusive environments and how do we promote that? And how do we welcome folks? And by the way, at that time when I came out, Barry Dunn was about 500 employees. We're closer to 1,000 now. I went on an 8-month journey, actually longer than that, about an 11-month journey before I came out. I was having conversations internally with my firm about what it would look like, and I was terrified. I was worried I was going to lose my job. I was worried I was going to lose my family, my friends, and a whole bunch of other things. But I also knew that for me, financially, losing my job was one of the big, big problems. And so I started having conversations with folks inside my company about whether I could actually do it. And I will tell you that those conversations went like this. I'm not sure if I can do this, but if I did, what would it look like? And I had conversations with people at the top levels of my firm. I will tell you, at that time and still today, I'm the only known trans person that's out within the firm. And we're approximately 1,000 employees. I don't think I'm the only one in the firm, but I'm the only one that's out. But being able to come out meant I had to have a certain level of comfort about the firm that I was with. And quite frankly, that started from the day I walked into the place. And the things I saw them doing, the culture that I saw that they had internally, when Gia did her presentation, it wasn't the presentation in and of itself that prompted me to send a secret email to my HR director and say, I'm a trans woman working for Barry Dunn. What would happen if I came out? By the way, her response to me was nothing. And I was like, I don't think you understand. Okay? I have clients all over the country that I'm meeting with, police departments, by the way, right? Has anybody here heard about the traditional experiences of the queer community and police agencies, right? There's not exactly a great reputation about that, right? So one of my fears was not only do I have to worry about my job and whether they're going to accept me in my job, but what about the clients that I have to work with? How are they going to be? And by the way, getting a little ahead of myself, when I did come out, every single one of my clients was completely accepting. In fact, overwhelmingly so. The support I received from the clients was amazing. But the reality is that the ability to even think about being able to come out started with my recognition of the culture that the organization had. Oh, there it is. Some of you, go back, oh, there we go. Some of you may have seen this before, the cultural iceberg, right? There's this question of what is our real culture? There's the culture that people see when they see our organization, right? It's what's visible, it's what we project. That's kind of what's above the ocean line, if you will. What we know is that the bulk of an iceberg actually rests below the surface and no one can really see it. And so it's a great metaphor for what culture is. What is your culture and how does that dynamic affect people's sense of belonging, people's sense that they can be who they want to be within the workplace without fear of repercussion, flashback, getting fired, being ridiculed, any of those kind of things. We have, in the cultural world, we have a front stage and a backstage, right? That front stage is, this is what other people see, but what's really going on, right? Many of us have been in those organizations where, sure, they say this, and then there's a meeting after the meeting, and everybody closes the door, and there's a whole different conversation that's going on, right? When I got to Barry Dunn, I won't go into details, but I saw some things that they were doing that led me to believe, I think this front stage and backstage is pretty close for these guys. Now remember, I study organizations for a living. That's what I do. So I'm paying attention to a lot of things that may be ignored or just not visible to others. But as I was doing that, I was thinking, this place actually might be okay. And I will tell you that from the instant I reached out internally, I first talked to the HR director. Following that, I talked to the number 2 person in our firm who was amazingly supportive, effectively told me that they were going to support me. And I think I asked 30 or 40 times if I was going to lose my job. That didn't happen, obviously. At each level and at each interval within the firm, as I asked those questions, I received amazing support. And by the way, the firm had never been through this. The things that Chris was talking about, that list of leadership things, interestingly enough, those were cultural aspects within the organization that they had never applied in this scenario that I put in front of them. Okay? And one of the things that happened during the course of this was I had conversations about what does this look like when I do this. And by the way, it's a little funny story that one of the people in the upper leadership area said, well, so how long is this going to take? You know, so you're going to come out and how long are you going to be gone? I said, no, I'm going to come back on Monday, which was kind of interesting. And so I actually helped craft an email that went out to the firm, to the entirety of our firm, describing that this is who you've known and worked with, and they're going to be Michelle going forward. And something really amazing happened when that email went out. I received 60 email replies internally from people within my firm, most of whom I had never met and did not know. what does that suggest to you about the front stage, backstage culture, right? So when we talk about the broad aspect of inclusivity and how your organization is going to respond to folks internally, it becomes a question of people. How do we value our people? How do we treat our people? How do we value the problems and the challenges and the issues that our people have? In what ways do we visibly demonstrate that? And in what ways do we invisibly demonstrate that? What decisions are we making in the background on behalf of our people that ultimately impact them within their workplace? And when we start talking about the future and who we want to hire, people we're hiring today have choices about where they go. By and large, it's an employee's market right now. And our employees are astute. When I started in policing, Al Gore had not invented the internet yet, okay? We couldn't just go online and look around and dig into different aspects about an organization to figure out what they were all about. But today, the people in the workforce that are entering today, they're very tech savvy. And they will seek those things out and ask themselves, especially if they're part of the queer community or if they have a child or another family member, they're going to ask those questions of themselves as they seek an organization that they want to be in a like-minded space with. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of pause there because I think we're getting some of the stuff in the questions, but that's a quick rundown on my story. It's how I got here. And by the way, I want to just share that I have been doing this full-time consulting now for 10 years. And I have, in the last 5 years since I've been out, or 4.5 years since I've been out, I've had many, many clients across the country. In fact, last year I paid taxes in 12 states, if that tells you anything. And at every organization I've been involved with, I have been met with complete respect, whether it's police organizations, fire organizations, anywhere across the public safety space. And as it happens, last week, I was in Austin, Texas for the 4th World LGBTQIA+ Conference for Criminal Justice Professionals. And Austin, Texas sponsored. It's the first time it's been in the United States. I was there, had a chance to speak to that group. And I want to just share something with you because I think there's a lot of negative stuff that we're seeing in the press and a lot of that we're seeing in politics, and it's real. And I don't mean to discount that in any way, shape, or form. But there were 250 folks at this conference that were all about understanding how to support queer folks internally and externally in the communities and in the spaces that they serve. And I think that's remarkable. And it says something about an industry that has traditionally had, again, for some good reasons, been at the fore of some pretty negative stuff. I saw and was really encouraged by some really cool stuff that I saw with the people that were there and what some organizations are doing around the country. So like Chris, I'll be here later as well if folks want to ask questions. But I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sit down and we're going to go through a little bit of a Q&A. So thank you.
Michelle? Michelle. Thoughts, questions, comments for any of you all out there? Yeah.
Might be easier.
I'm very good at projecting. I worked with youth for a long time and had to control a crowd, but this is more, level. So thinking about an organization that is trying to support not just LGBTQ plus folks, but in particular transgender individuals in this time period, are there do you folks each have a top, say like a top tip or a top thing that you can do to support the folks at your organization? I know you spoke a little of this in there, but I don't know if everyone has like a thing that you're like, yes, this is the first thing or the most, yeah.
Well, I will just say that in Barry Dunn, we have an internal DEI committee. I'm actually the immediate past chair of that organization. And so there's an intentional effort by the firm to address marginalized communities and create a safe space for everyone internally. So certainly there's that piece of it. We also have employee resource groups that are representing the different sections within the firm as well. And those are overt examples, and that's great. But those don't happen unless you have started the culture in the first place, right? And unless you've built the right culture, unless you have the right mindset within your leadership. And certainly Barry Dunn's not immune to the political forces that are going on right now, and we're trying very hard to continue to support our people internally without getting ourselves in the crosshairs externally. But the biggest tip I can give is, it has to start at the beginning. Where does culture come from, right? Where does it come from? All of us know what our culture is at some level. If we went into your organization and asked about your culture, we'd probably get pretty similar responses from folks. And by the way, we do that. I do that. But it's making sure we have the right culture in the first place. So embedding that culture when people come into onboarding. What do your externally facing hiring websites look like? How do they demonstrate different folks from different places in that? And then, and this is another big one, is not only embedding that culture, but how do we sustain it? It's through reinforcing. How do we talk about it? Do we mention it in meetings? Is it in our emails and in our communications, whether those are, Zoom meetings or whether it's in something written that comes out? Do we continue to message the value of our people? There's a phrase, I don't know if I made it up or stole it, but it's the people that make it work, not the work that makes the people. And if we live that, then we have to do some things for people to visibly see that. And I will also tell you that our firm does regular surveys of our personnel and generally includes a couple of questions that relate to that area.
Great. That's really helpful. I was going to say that little piece there about, I know companies do a great job of surveying everybody, their customer base. How is your care? Like immediately, as soon as you leave the place. But one thing, thank you for that question. I think it's really important. There's such heightened awareness right now, especially on trans people. There's a tendency to overreact. And I think that's something to be aware of is, you don't want to hover, you don't want to like overreact to someone who you think may be trans or is trans. They're there for a reason to do the job you hired them to do. And checking in with them, if there's something you need, great. If someone doesn't need anything, don't overdo it. Don't assume someone is trans just because, they look a certain way. I think that's what we see a lot of people sort of jumping the gun and again, being trans is no one's business too. Unless it is a real reason why anyone should know if someone's trans or not trans in the workplace. I think that's an important sort of reminder. You're hiring people not because they're trans. That's illegal. You can't hire someone just because they're this or that, other than their skills and their ability to do their job and their experience. And so be mindful of how do we create inclusive environments for everybody that include transgender people. And when you make your workspace inclusive for transgender people, you're making your workspace inclusive for everybody. And I think that's a really good reminder. When we talk about all sorts of rights related to LGBTQ rights or disability rights, when you take those steps to make your workplace more inclusive of people of color, people with disabilities, people with LGBTQ, you're making it inclusive for everybody. And so that would be my reminder as well.
Thanks, Gia. I think I would just offer, for me, it's about creating a workspace where it's okay and safe to share what folks want to share or what folks need to share. And so just making sure that as leaders or as coworkers, we've created this environment where if somebody wants or needs to check in with me, I'm there for that, and I'm prepared to manage that, whether that is a supportive shoulder, whether that's a formal resource like an EAP program or an employee resource group, or whether it's just a comforting comment, just something that lets those folks know that it's okay to not be okay at work sometimes. Oh, thank you.
So I am an individual who is not in a leadership position at this time, but I'll put it a little closer. But as an employee, I wonder if any of you have any suggestions for, as a member of the community myself, how people might be able to find resources within their employers or organizations, and how to even advocate for themselves within an organization as well.
My first advice is start with HR. First of all, look at your policies. And by the way, it's one of the things that we do regularly when we do our projects is look at internal policies. And oftentimes we find organizations, especially in the public safety space, that have externally facing policies, but they haven't thought about it internally. What happens when someone internally transitions, and what restroom are they going to use, and those kind of questions, right? But the first thing I would tell you is start with your HR folks, start with your policies, and quite frankly, I mean, if your HR folks aren't giving you the right answers, that's a clue, and that's kind of that would be a troubling clue. But that's where I would start.
For sure. Some of us in small nonprofits, we don't have HR. I kind of make it up. Don't tell anyone that, really. But another thing that can give people strength and a sense of solidarity is sometimes feeling like you're the only queer person on the staff, or you don't know, is really finding some bonds and ability to form a group within a workplace. And I know a lot of workplaces have those sort of subgroups that are diversity related or LGBTQ related. And that can give you a sense of power, and a sense that we can approach leadership, not just as me approaching leadership, but as a group of people can have more weight. And you can feel more secure in asking for certain things if you feel like certain things aren't being addressed in the workplace. It isn't just you against them. It's actually there's a group of people. And those can be allies. Like, yeah, actually, it would be nicer if we had, gender-neutral bathrooms for everybody, because people like privacy or things like that. And it isn't just you, it's actually a group of people asking these things. So I do like collective conversations in the workplace and finding other people who are either part of the community or allies to form those either official groups or unofficial groups, I think is another strategy as well.
And I would just add along those same lines, some of my favorite employee resource group stories are the stories of a group of employees coming together and doing a book club, or a documentary club, or a podcast club, or going out to lunch together once a month kind of group. It doesn't have to be a HR sanctioned, this is the LGBTQ affinity group or employee resource group. Just a group of staff coming together and networking over this shared experience.
Hi, thank you all so much. I had a question, maybe for the whole panel, but Michelle, I was thinking about at Barry Dunn, the people that, like, maybe you're on the DEI committee and you have people that are very engaged, and then how about reaching people that maybe are not as engaged or don't participate as much. Like we have a training and then we have a debrief afterwards, and I notice the same people come to those. And there's kind of like champions at the organization. And so just wondering about, because I really appreciated what you said about the culture of an organization, and like to keep that going, you have to have intention and like keep things happening. You can't just be like, okay, we made it, we've got the culture. And I would love, Chris, resources about like that leadership list you have. That would be amazing, because there's, like Gia said, there's just, it applies to just all groups, just being inclusive. Like we'll be welcoming to everyone. So I would love the resources. And Michelle, if you have thoughts about engaging more of the 1,000 people. We don't have that many, but.
We only care about the DEI committee. We don't care about, no. Honestly, that's a conversation that we've had regularly within that. How do you broaden that scope? And so ERGs were a great way to do that, right? We have a certain group of people that are in the committee, on the formal committee, but then we've spread into these ERGs and various messaging. We send out regular messages across the firm with things that talk about upcoming events that affect the Pride community. Those go out firm-wide. And so there are regular communications. And we have folks that are advocating internally within their official roles within the firm that are regularly talking to firm leadership about the policies and about the strategies and the vision for the firm. And so admittedly, that is a challenge, right? It is a challenge to reach to reach across to folks within your organization to give them a line of sight on everything that's happening. And in fact, even some of our surveys come back and we're like, wow, we would have thought that folks would have had more information or felt more informed about some of these things. And so that's just a charge for us to say, okay, again, and I'm going to go back to onboarding. There's so much, and I'm going to give you a police example. When we train in new police officers, they come in and they go into field training. And generally for most organizations around the country, that's anywhere from 3 to 6 months of training with a partner. And usually there's 1 or 2 or 3 different trainers that they're with during that time. Who you use as your trainers matters. If you've got the old crusty old salt who is grousing about everything, guess what kind of product you're going to turn out? So we need to be really, really thoughtful about what we put into the machine so that when we get new people and we start to build them up within the organization, they're getting the kind of cultural inputs that they need on the front end. And again, part of that is helping them understand we have all these other things, by the way. If you didn't know about this, you don't need to self-disclose, like Gia said. But by the way, there's this stuff, and some of them may be driven to reach out and do some of those things. But I'll admit that's a challenge.
Yeah, a couple things just pop into my tinny little head about that. And sometimes it's just, that whatever that the person or persons who are don't feel like they're engaged. I wouldn't make assumptions of why they're not engaging. That could be a thing, like you said, the crusty, whatever, salty person. I love that. That's great. Maybe they're too close to this and they don't want to give away that they're LGBTQ themselves, or if someone in their life is, or they're struggling with something on their own, and they're just don't want to participate because they don't want to seem adjacent to it right now. And so that's something to consider. Some people just step aside or don't want to engage because they don't want to seem too related to that topic. Maybe it's too sensitive for them, for sure. And then, making sure that you're but uplifting LGBTQ people, but not on LGBTQ subjects. It's so important that we raise up folks from different, experiences who have great expertise. And it's not about them being LGBTQ. It's like they are really good with data or data hygiene or risk management or whatever that is, and they just happen to be LGBTQ. And so people can sort of subconsciously make that connection, not that that person is getting up and talking about being LGBTQ, but they're really good at this thing. Oh, wait a minute, they are trans and they're really good at data, but it's not like in their face that this trans person is doing that. I think that subtlety around bringing people into these conversations a little more, with a little more nuance, what I would say too. And since you're here, Meredith, I just want to mention something about older folks. you know, it's really important that we recognize, and I mentioned up on the slide, there were 25% of teenagers are LGBTQ. But this whole idea of workforce also involves older folks, making sure we're engaging older people in the workplace, and don't discount LGBTQ people or older folks aren't going to get it. That's ageist. Older folks actually can be really wonderfully welcoming and actually really great leaders and mentors for other parts of the workforce. What I have found really in working, especially with families, is sometimes parents have a really hard time with their LGBTQ child. They just have a hard time accepting, understanding. They had dreams and visions for their kid or whatever. But grandparents tend to be like so much better. And I think that has to do with wisdom and time and understanding the perspective of life where, and so I think the perspective of older folks in this can be really, really welcoming. Let's not ignore the value of older folks in the workplace and what they bring to this conversation, for sure, and that LGBTQ people can be older adults as well. And we have folks who've been out for a long time, for 50, 60 years, but we also know there are older folks who are just coming out now. And we want to recognize that as well. So let's not discount older folks in terms of being really important players in making your workplace inclusive.
I want to add one thing, kind of go back to one of the points Jay just made. You talk about including people in various aspects of your organization, whether it's presentations or projects or leadership roles, irrespective, right, of the fact that they may be in the community. But there's a caution here for leaders to make sure that they're not overlooking someone who has that expertise. In your organization, for example, if you have someone who is in the community who has a really high elevated expertise, and now we go over to do this other project or a presentation and they're absent, there are people within your organization that are going to go, why the heck isn't Gia part of this, right? So when we think about culture and we think about how we support our people, just that's something else to be aware of, that we bring the right people to the table who are the right people. If folks that are at a different echelon of competency or contribution level aren't part of that, there are going to be some people, especially those who may be fence sitters wondering what's going on in the organization, that may take that in a negative way.
As a member of the community and a mom of an up-and-coming 1 in 4, what do you recommend for assisting the up-and-coming generations in being able to be their authentic self as they go into the workforce? What do you recommend that they look for, and how do they spot where they can be their authentic self? Because in our area, unfortunately, we still have a lot of the good old boys club, and it's really hard to break past that.
Yeah, you know, I think as you were asking your question, the thing that came immediately to mind is that a lot of these leadership competencies and inclusion in the workplace we're talking about absolutely parallel to families and schools and communities as well. And so replace leadership with parent or caregiver or teacher or school administrator, and those competencies don't change. And so I think about some of the best practices of representation and making sure that queer youth see themselves reflected back in every space that they exist in. And allyship, what that looks like, the ability to network. We don't call it an ERG in the schools. We call it maybe a civil rights team or a gay straight alliance or a gender sexuality alliance or those pieces. So this is not just reflective of how to create more inclusive workplaces. It can absolutely be generalized. And this idea of psychological safety and wellness and the ability to check in and listen and believe and not make assumptions and not overreact. Apply everything you've heard over the last hour into the family and school environment, and it absolutely still tracks.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris. That's very helpful. I think one of the things I'm thinking about we're running a youth leadership camp this week, and Chris is playing a role in that. We have 52 kids from around the state. And it can be a really wonderful week for young people to let their guard down, be themselves, feel joy. But we also are very careful about not setting them up for failure. And so you may be a really great parent. I'm assuming you are. Absolutely. Why wouldn't you be, right? And you may have some queer kids in your life. But we have to be realistic. And the conversations we have with our young people are really specific about how can we can't change the world. I mean, I've learned that. I can't even get my dishes done. I can't change someone else's behavior, actions, or emotions. The only thing I can do is change myself, right? There's no spoon, right? And so what can we do with the people around us to prepare them for a world that may be not as welcoming as they want? And so how do you practice those things? How do you instill some durability in people, especially young queer people, where, one false move, the wrong pronoun, and they will collapse into a puddle and hide in their room for a month? And how do we lift up and find a way to build some strength and resilience? And that is through friendships, through having a network to debrief what just happened, not take everything so deeply personally. And those are really hard things to instill in people, not just young people, all sorts of people. But I think that's part of the conversation, is making sure we're not setting up people for failure. What can we do to instill some of that durability so they can get through, at times, what is a hostile world? And we can't deny that. That's the reality of the world we live in. And what can we do to build a more welcoming network of friends and community, so when they need to debrief after a bad day at work, they feel like they can go back tomorrow and feel like they can actually, do the things that they need to do. So I think there's probably more conversations around how do we build that up. At the same time, creating more inclusive, welcoming workplaces so we don't have to do that, but we can do both.
And so for those of you taking notes, the two words that Gia said that I want to make sure you've written down are resilience and joy. And creating moments to build both is absolutely essential, and I will also say life-saving.
The only other thing I was going to add is, as folks are going out in the workforce and they're looking, do research. Go to the website, look at what's in their mission statement, look for culture statements, look within that organization, and dare I say, when you're in an interview at the end and they go, do you have any questions? You say, can you give me an example of how you support your people in the workplace? Right? Let's ask a question. Let's be bold enough to ask that question. And by the way, I used to be one of those people that said, don't ever ask a question at the end of an interview. But if you're in that community, if you're concerned about those things, don't go blindly forward, right? Ask the question.
I will actually have a question. I am going to share a little bit of a story first to kind of set that question up. I actually came out when I was still in high school. I was 15 years old and had a traumatic experience that put me back in the closet. And in my first couple of workplaces, I, instead of having a girlfriend named Meredith, I had a boyfriend named Michael. And I learned through support that I kind of got closer with some colleagues that I had made decisions for other people, and I decided how they were going to support me or react to me. And now I work in HR, and creating psychological safety in the workplace is really important. In the types of environments where workplaces are really doing that well, we are seeing that a lot of folks are coming, especially right now, a lot of folks are kind of coming back to that and saying, this is too politically charged for me, and this language is not something that I am agreeing with or is too difficult. How do you encourage workplaces to kind of move beyond that argument?
Let me just say this. If GIA had given the same message this past June, I wouldn't have come out. I would have never sent the email. Not in today's climate. And that's a really sad testimony. I would have been afraid to even send that first volley. And that's a scary part of what's going on within our workforces. I'll say this, back to one of the points that Chris made, allyship is really, really critical to folks within organizations. And even if your organization is struggling because of some of the political firestorm that we're all immersed in, identifying and finding good allies internally as part of your support, to be part of your support team, is a really, really critical and helpful way to keep your head above water even when things are seemingly really rough. One of those 60 emails I got from someone I did not know is one of my greatest champions and one of my best friends today. So they may come in the least likely places, but certainly finding good allies, I think, is a good piece.
That's a really great question, especially in today's world, is how do we navigate the politically charged environment. And I think one of the things that I've learned is, I think probably my parents taught me this, not by like directly teaching me this, but the way they responded to me coming out when I was in my 40s and they were in their 70s, very conservative Republican Catholics, Fox News watching Trump voters. Yep, those are my parents. Surprise, you have a queer trans daughter. What are you going to do about that? You know, and I think I learned in that process is they may never get what it means to be trans. Like the idea of like acceptance doesn't have to mean you have to like understand everything or even agree with everything. And I think there is this idea out there that if we talk about these issues in the workplace, that you're politically aligning with something. But I think you can just say, you know what, I understand you have this belief, and I'm not here to change your belief system. Absolutely, you have that at your core. But here in this workplace, these are the things that we expect you to do, and that includes being respectful to other people and be welcoming and inclusive. And I think approaching it in a way like not being confrontational about someone's belief system, and especially if that's connected to a political point of view, is recognizing we still can do the jobs we're asked to do. We still can be inclusive of welcoming other people and not feel like they're like compromising on their own values. And being honest about that. I think trying to skirt around that in some way and not having that conversation will make the situation worse. But if you know you're working with someone maybe in that position, and have that conversation. I understand that's where you are, and we still can do the work together that we're here for. And I think there are ways we can do that without making the situation worse. That's kind of would be my strategy.
And given that we have 1 minute, I'm going to, per usual, Miss Taylor Swift says it better than I ever could. And my favorite new quote from last night's podcast episode reads as follows: "You should see your energy as expensive. It's a luxury, and some people can't afford it." And for me, whether the person I'm working with is 15 or 50, where they give that energy is their decision, and not everyone can afford our shine. So with that, thank you so much. I think the three of us are going to be lingering about for a little bit. I know this room is transitioning to the next session at 10:30. I'll be downstairs